The mob dragged her to the gallows. But the executioner froze when the Duke arrived holding something mysterious in his hand. The mob's roar fills the square outside Newgate Prison, their fists raised, jeering as Lady Amelia Thornefield stands on the gallows platform, bound and broken. The executioner's hand reaches for the lever, the rough hemp noose tight around her pale throat. The crowd's breath catches. This is it, the moment of her destruction. The trapdoor begins to release, but it never opens. A voice cuts through the chaos, impossibly commanding, stopping every heart in the square. The crowd gasps. A man in a travel-worn military coat strides forward, impossibly alive. Lucian Cartwright, the Duke of Ashmore, stands before the magistrate, a sealed document held high. His storm-grey eyes lock onto hers, piercing, intense. A strange emotion flickers across his scarred face. But why has he come? What does this ghost want with her now? Hello there. If you're enjoying this historical romantic story, I'd be so grateful if you give this video a like or a subscribe. It helps me bring you more stories of passion, danger, and history. And if you're up for it, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I like to know where in the world these stories reach. Now, let's continue. Grey dawn broke over Newgate Prison like an executioner's blade, all crimson and gold bleeding across the ancient stone walls. Lady Amelia Thornefield stumbled as rough hands shoved her forward, her bound wrists screaming in protest. The rope had rubbed her skin raw during 3 nights in the magistrate's cell, but she refused to cry out. She would give them nothing. Not her tears, not her pleas, and certainly not a false confession to a murder she had not committed. Move faster, murderess. A voice cut through the morning air, sharp as broken glass. The crowd pressed closer, a sea of hostile faces eager for blood and spectacle. Amelia kept her emerald eyes fixed straight ahead, her expression carefully blank. Her auburn hair, once pinned elegantly for society dinners, now hung in tangled waves around her shoulders, deliberately disheveled by her captors to complete the picture of depravity they were painting. They reached the gallows platform erected in the prison yard, its shadow stretching long and dark across the cobblestones. The sight of it made her stomach twist. She had attended garden parties in Mayfair, danced at court presentations, managed an earl's household with dignity and grace. Now she would die here, branded a poisoner, her name forever destroyed. Citizens of London. The magistrate's voice rang out, silencing the mob. We gather here to witness the lawful execution of Lady Amelia Thornefield, convicted of the cold-blooded murder of her husband, the Earl of Merryweather, by means of poison administered with malicious intent. The crowd roared its approval. Amelia's mind drifted back 6 weeks, to the moment her life had shattered beyond repair. She had been in the Earl's private study late one evening, searching for the household accounts he claimed to have misplaced. Instead, she had found letters hidden beneath a false bottom in his desk drawer. Letters written in French, discussing supply routes, military positions, plans to destabilize the Crown's authority. Her husband, the man she had been forced to marry to save her family from financial ruin, was a traitor. She had confronted him that very night. How could you betray your queen? Your country? Her voice had shaken with fury and disbelief. The Earl had turned on her, his face twisted with rage. You stupid woman. You understand nothing of power, of politics. The Crown is weak. Change is coming, and I intend to profit from it. I cannot let you do this, Amelia had said, clutching the letters to her chest. I will take these to the authorities. He had lunged at her then, his hands going for her throat. They had struggled violently, crashing into furniture, sending books and papers flying. In the chaos, the Earl had stumbled backward, striking his head against the corner of his massive oak desk with a sickening crack. He had collapsed, blood pooling beneath him, his eyes vacant. Amelia had stood frozen, gasping for air, her dress torn, bruises already forming on her throat where he had tried to strangle her. She had reached for the bell pull to summon help, to explain what had happened. But Reginald Hammond, the Earl's younger brother, had arrived first. He had taken one look at the scene, at the letters still clutched in her trembling hands, and his calculating mind had worked quickly. "Murder," he had said coldly, plucking the letters from her grasp. "You poisoned him. Everyone knows you were unhappy in this marriage. These letters prove nothing except your husband's private business dealings, which you clearly could not understand." No. He attacked me. He was committing treason. But Reginald had already called for the servants, had already begun crafting the story that would seal her fate. The poison theory was perfect. The Earl had been complaining of stomach pains for weeks, symptoms Reginald himself had been causing with small doses of arsenic. Now he could blame the death entirely on Amelia, inherit the title and fortune, and destroy the evidence of his brother's treasonous conspiracy in one stroke. The trial had been swift and merciless. A bottle of rat poison was found in her chambers, placed there by Reginald's men. Servants testified to arguments between husband and wife. The Earl's physician confirmed symptoms consistent with poisoning. No one believed her claims of treason and self-defense. She was a woman, after all. What did she know of politics and loyalty? "The punishment for such crimes," the magistrate announced, pulling Amelia back to the present horror, "is death by hanging. Let this serve as a warning to all who would betray their sacred marriage vows with such evil intent." The executioner, hooded and silent, climbed the platform with heavy steps. He was a massive man, his hand steady as he checked the noose, testing its strength. This was not personal for him. It was simply his duty. Amelia was forced to stand upon the trapdoor, her legs trembling despite her determination to show no fear. The executioner placed the noose around her neck, adjusting it with professional efficiency. The rough hemp scraped against her skin, already bruised from where the Earl had tried to strangle her before his death. Through the crowd, she could see Reginald Hammond standing near the front, his expression one of satisfied triumph. He had won. He had silenced her, claimed his brother's legacy, and would now live in wealth and power while she became nothing more than a cautionary tale about murderous wives. The magistrate raised his hand to signal the drop. Time seemed to slow. Amelia could hear her own heartbeat, loud as a drum in her ears. She could smell the morning damp, incongruously fresh and clean. She could feel the morning sun beginning to warm her face, perhaps the last warmth she would ever know. She closed her emerald eyes and thought of her mother, who had died when Amelia was just a girl. Thought of the secret wedding in a small chapel 6 years ago, when she had married a young officer named Lucian Cartwright before he sailed away to war. Thought of the letter declaring him dead, lost in some distant colonial battle. Thought of her family's tears when they told her she must marry the Earl to save them from debtor's prison. Is this truly the end? She wondered. Condemned by lies, destroyed by those with power and greed? The executioner reached for the lever. Then everything changed. A voice rang out across the prison yard, cutting through the morning air with such absolute authority that every person froze. "Stop! This execution is unlawful." The crowd parted like water before a ship's prow. A figure emerged from the sea of bodies, tall and commanding, dressed in a travel-worn military coat that had once been fine but now bore the marks of hard roads and harder battles. Lucian Cartwright, Duke of Ashmore, strode through the stunned mob with the bearing of a man who had faced death and survived. Amelia's eyes flew open at the collective gasp from the crowd. Her breath caught in her throat, the noose suddenly forgotten. She had never thought to see him again. London had mourned the young Duke 5 years ago when news came of his disappearance in the colonial wars. His estate had passed into trust. His name had become a memory. But he was here. Alive. Changed. He had left England as a young officer full of idealism and hope. The man who now climbed the gallows steps was something else entirely. War had carved away everything soft, leaving only sharp angles and hard purpose. A scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, pale against his sun-darkened skin. His storm-grey eyes held shadows that spoke of horrors witnessed and survived. His dark hair, once carefully styled, was now pulled back simply, functional rather than fashionable. He was beautiful in the way a winter storm was beautiful, powerful, dangerous, impossible to ignore. Those grey eyes swept across the crowd with casual command, and even the most vocal citizens found themselves stepping backward involuntarily. Then his gaze found hers, and Amelia felt the impact like a physical force. Recognition flashed between them, followed by something deeper, something that made her heart stutter in her chest despite the noose around her neck. The executioner had stepped back from the lever, confusion evident in his posture. Lucian turned to face the magistrate, who had descended from his platform, sputtering with indignation. "Your Grace, we believed you dead. But even so, this is a matter of crown justice. This woman has been lawfully convicted." "This woman," Lucian interrupted, his voice dangerously quiet, "is my wife." The words fell like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock through the entire gathering. He reached into his coat and withdrew a sealed document, holding it high so all could see the royal seal pressed into the wax. "Our marriage license, signed 6 years ago, witnessed and authenticated, bearing the seal of the Archbishop himself. Lady Amelia Thornefield was legally bound to me before her marriage to the Earl of Merryweather. That subsequent marriage was invalid. Under the law, she is my property, my responsibility, my wife. This execution is void." The magistrate's face went pale, then red. "Your Grace, this is highly irregular. The woman was convicted of murder." "Then I demand a new trial," Lucian said, his tone allowing no argument. "As is my right as her husband and a peer of the realm. Until such time, she remains in my custody." He turned back to Amelia, and for just a moment, his marble facade cracked. Something human flickered in those grey eyes. Regret, perhaps, or remembered tenderness. He climbed onto the trapdoor beside her, ignoring the executioner's weak protest, and reached up to remove the noose from her neck. His fingers brushed against her skin, warm and gentle despite their calluses. "Forgive me," he whispered, so quietly only she could hear. "Forgive me for being too late. For letting them do this to you." The noose fell away. Amelia gasped, drawing her first full breath in what felt like hours. Her knees buckled, strength fleeing now that death had been forestalled. Lucian caught her before she could fall, one arm sweeping beneath her legs, the other supporting her back. He lifted her as though she weighed nothing, cradling her against his chest. Through her torn dress, she could feel the solid strength of him, could smell leather and gunpowder and something that was uniquely him, unchanged despite the years. Her hands came up instinctively, clutching at his coat for stability as the world tilted around her. "Why?" The word escaped her lips as barely a whisper, lost in confusion and shock and desperate hope. Lucian looked down at her, and for just a heartbeat, she saw the young officer she had married, the man who had promised to return to her, the man she had mourned. "Because I made you a vow," he said quietly. "And I keep my vows, Amelia. Always." The world grayed at the edges. Amelia felt consciousness slipping away like sand through her fingers. Her last coherent thought before darkness claimed her was a question that would haunt her waking. What happens now? She felt herself being carried, heard the murmur of the crowd parting before them, sensed arguments beginning behind them as the magistrate protested and Reginald Hammond's voice rose in fury. Then there was only darkness, and in that darkness, a memory. Lucian's voice on their wedding day, speaking vows in the small chapel, promising to love and protect her until death. He had come back from the dead to keep that promise. Behind them, the prison yard remained frozen in chaos. The executioner stood on the platform, staring at the discarded noose. The magistrate clutched the marriage license Lucian had thrust into his hands, reading it again and again as though the words might change. Reginald Hammond's face was white with rage and something else. Fear, perhaps, or the cold realization that his carefully constructed lies were beginning to unravel. And the noose swayed gently in the morning breeze, empty, its purpose unfulfilled, as the Duke of Ashmore carried his wife away toward an uncertain future. Amelia woke to the gentle rocking of a carriage and the muted sound of wheels on gravel. Her eyes opened slowly, adjusting to the dim interior lit only by the fading afternoon light filtering through velvet curtains. She lay on a cushioned bench, a wool blanket tucked carefully around her shoulders. Her throat ached where the noose had pressed, and her wrists burned from the rope marks, but she was alive and moving farther from Newgate Prison with each passing moment. She pushed herself upright, wincing at the protest of bruised muscles, and peered through the window. The London streets had given way to open countryside, fields stretching golden in the autumn light. Trees lined the road, their leaves turning copper and rust. They had been traveling for at least an hour, perhaps longer. Across from her sat Lucian, his long frame filling the opposite bench, his storm-grey eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the window. He had removed his travel-worn coat, revealing a simple white shirt and waistcoat beneath, both of fine quality but showing signs of hard use. The scar on his face seemed more pronounced in the carriage shadows, a pale line that told stories he would likely never share. He sensed her movement and turned his gaze to her. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence between them was heavy with 6 years of separation, loss, and unanswered questions. "Where are we going?" Amelia's voice came out rougher than she intended, her throat still raw. "Cartwright Manor. My estate, about 15 miles northwest of London. You will be safe there while we determine our next course of action." His tone was formal, carefully controlled, as though speaking to an acquaintance rather than the woman he had once promised to love forever. Amelia nodded, pulling the blanket tighter around herself. Safe. The word felt foreign after weeks of terror and imprisonment. She wanted to ask him 1,000 questions, wanted to demand explanations for his disappearance and his miraculous return, but exhaustion pressed down on her like a physical weight. Instead, she simply watched the countryside pass, letting the rhythmic movement of the carriage lull her into a state somewhere between waking and dreaming. The carriage turned onto a private drive lined with ancient oak trees, their gnarled branches forming a canopy overhead. At the end of the drive, Cartwright Manor rose against the darkening sky like something from a Gothic tale. It was built of grey stone, 3 stories tall with tall windows that reflected the sunset's dying light. Ivy climbed the eastern wall, and chimneys jutted from the roof like sentinels standing guard. The manor spoke of old wealth and older traditions, of a family that had held power for generations. As the carriage rolled to a stop before the main entrance, the front doors opened. A woman emerged, tall and thin with iron-grey hair pulled back in a severe bun. She wore a housekeeper's black dress with a chatelaine of keys hanging at her waist, and her sharp features betrayed nothing as she watched the Duke descend from the carriage. Lucian turned and offered his hand to help Amelia down. She took it, feeling the calluses on his palm that had not been there 6 years ago when he had been a young officer fresh from the academy. His grip was steady and strong as he guided her onto the gravel drive, though he released her hand the moment her feet were firmly planted. The housekeeper's eyes widened slightly as she took in Amelia's torn dress, her tangled hair, the rope burns visible on her wrists and throat. To her credit, she quickly composed herself and executed a perfect curtsy. "Your Grace, we did not expect you to return today, and with a guest." Her voice was measured, professional, but Amelia detected the faintest tremor of surprise beneath the formal words. "Mrs. Penelope Langford, This is Lady Amelia Thornefield." Lucian paused, then added with deliberate emphasis, "My wife." Mrs. Langford's composure cracked completely. Her mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. "Your wife, Your Grace? But we were told you had no wife. We were told you were dead these 5 years past. Reports of my death were premature, as you can see. As for my marriage, it was conducted in secret before I left for the colonies. Lady Amelia requires a chamber, a bath, suitable clothing, and a meal. She has endured considerable hardship and requires rest and care. See to it immediately." The housekeeper recovered her professional demeanor with visible effort. "Of course, Your Grace. Right away." She turned to Amelia with an expression that had softened considerably, revealing the kind heart beneath the stern exterior. "My lady, please come with me. We shall have you comfortable in no time at all." Amelia followed Mrs. Langford into the manor, acutely aware of Lucian's presence behind her. The entrance hall was grand but sombre, all dark wood paneling and marble floors. Portraits lined the walls, generations of Cartwrights staring down with varying degrees of severity. The furniture was expensive but clearly unused, the air holding that particular stillness of a house in mourning. Mrs. Langford led her up a sweeping staircase to the second floor, then down a corridor lined with closed doors. She opened one near the end, revealing a spacious bedchamber decorated in shades of cream and pale blue. A four-poster bed dominated the room, its hangings made of heavy damask. A fire had already been lit in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the walls. "This was the Duchess's chamber, my lady," Mrs. Langford explained as she moved about the room, lighting candles and drawing curtains. "The Duke's mother. She passed 10 years ago, and the room has stood empty since. But it seems right that you should have it now." Amelia stood in the doorway, overwhelmed by the sudden change in her circumstances. This morning she had stood on the gallows awaiting death. Now she stood in a duchess's chambers, addressed as a lady, offered comfort and safety. It felt like a dream from which she might wake at any moment. Mrs. Langford turned to face her fully, and her expression had transformed into one of genuine sympathy. "My lady, I cannot imagine what you have endured. But please know that you are safe here. His Grace may seem cold and distant since his return from the war, but he is a good man. He will protect you with his life if necessary." "His return," Amelia repeated softly. "How long has he been back in England?" 3 weeks, perhaps a month. He arrived one night without warning, looking as though he had walked through hell itself. He has been living like a ghost in his own home, spending his days locked in the study, speaking to no one except when absolutely necessary. We thought him lost forever, my lady. The whole household mourned him. To have him back is a miracle, though he is much changed from the young man who left." A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Servants entered carrying a copper bathtub, followed by others bearing buckets of steaming water. Mrs. Langford supervised the preparation of the bath with efficient commands, then shooed the servants out and helped Amelia remove her ruined dress. The hot water was heaven against her bruised skin. Mrs. Langford worked gently, washing Amelia's hair and treating her rope burns with a soothing salve that smelled of lavender and chamomile. As the grime and fear of imprisonment washed away, Amelia felt her mind beginning to clear, questions forming that demanded answers. Once she was clean and dressed in a borrowed nightgown and dressing robe, Mrs. Langford served her a simple meal of soup and bread at a small table by the fire. The food was plain but prepared with care, and Amelia realized she had not eaten properly in days. She forced herself to eat slowly despite her hunger, mindful of her unsettled stomach. As Mrs. Langford cleared the dishes, another knock came at the door. The housekeeper opened it to reveal Lucian, now dressed in fresh clothes, his hair damp from his own bath. He had shaved, removing several days' worth of stubble, and the effect was startling. He looked younger, more like the man Amelia remembered, though his eyes still held that new darkness. "Leave us," he said quietly to Mrs. Langford. The housekeeper curtsied and departed, closing the door behind her with a soft click. Lucian stood near the door, maintaining a careful distance, as though afraid to come too close. Amelia rose from her chair by the fire, pulling the dressing robe tighter around herself, suddenly conscious of her informal attire and loose hair. "We need to talk," he said, breaking the silence that had stretched between them. "There are things you must know, things I must explain. But first, I need you to understand something. I did not abandon you, Amelia. I did not choose to leave you alone and unprotected. They told me you were dead." Her voice was steadier now, though emotion threatened beneath the surface. "They brought a letter from your commanding officer. It said you were lost in battle, presumed killed. No body was recovered because the battlefield was overrun." The letter was accurate as far as it went. I was captured during a colonial skirmish, badly wounded and taken prisoner by local forces who had allied with enemy powers. I spent 3 years in captivity before I managed to escape. It took me another year to make my way back to civilization, and another year beyond that to recover enough to travel home. By the time I returned to England, 5 years had passed. 5 years during which you believed me dead. He moved closer now, his expression tight with controlled emotion. "I learned of your marriage to the Earl within days of my return. I learned that your family had been facing financial ruin and that the Earl had offered a solution in exchange for your hand. I do not blame you for accepting, Amelia. You thought yourself a widow. You did what you had to do to protect your family." "But our marriage," Amelia whispered. "If you were alive, then my marriage to the Earl was invalid from the beginning." "Precisely. Which is why I have been investigating the circumstances of his death since I returned. I did not believe the charges against you from the moment I heard them. I knew you, Amelia. I knew your character, your honor. You would never commit cold-blooded murder." He reached into his waistcoat and withdrew a folded document, the same marriage license he had presented at the gallows. He unfolded it carefully and held it out to her. Amelia took it with trembling hands, staring at the familiar signatures at the bottom. Her own handwriting, young and hopeful. Lucian's, bold and confident. The witness signatures of the chaplain and his wife. The date, 6 years past, when they had married in secret before Lucian's regiment departed. "I kept this with me through everything," Lucian said quietly. "Through battles and captivity and escape. It was the one proof I had that somewhere in the world, I had something worth surviving for. Someone worth returning to." Tears pricked at Amelia's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "You were too late. By the time you returned, I was already trapped in a nightmare. Married to a man I did not love, who turned out to be a traitor. And now accused of his murder when all I did was try to stop his treachery. Tell me what happened that night." Lucian's voice was gentle but firm. "Tell me everything. The truth will set you free, Amelia, but only if I know what we are fighting against." So she told him. She recounted finding the treasonous letters, confronting the Earl, the violent struggle, his accidental death. She described Reginald Hammond's calculated destruction of evidence and construction of the murder narrative. She explained the trial, the false testimony, the planted poison. She spoke until her voice grew hoarse, laying bare every horrible detail. Lucian listened without interruption, his expression growing darker with each revelation. When she finished, he stood silent for a long moment, his jaw clenched with barely controlled fury. "Reginald Hammond will answer for what he has done to you. I swear this on my life and my honor. But first, We must prove your innocence beyond any doubt. The marriage license saves you from immediate execution, but the murder charges remain. We need evidence of the Earl's treason and proof of Reginald's conspiracy. Only then can we clear your name completely and ensure your safety. And what of us? The question escaped before Amelia could stop it. We are married in the eyes of the law, but we are strangers now, Lucian. 6 years is a long time. We have both changed in ways we cannot undo. He looked at her then, truly looked at her, and for the first time since his return, she saw raw emotion break through his carefully maintained control. Pain, regret, longing, and something fiercer that made her breath catch. I know we are not the same people who married in that chapel. War changed me in ways I am still trying to understand. And you have survived horrors I wish you had never known. But I made you a vow, Amelia. For better or worse, in sickness and health, until death. I intend to honor that vow, even if it takes the rest of my life to prove myself worthy of you again. The tension between them was palpable now, 6 years of separation and grief and unspoken longing filling the space. Amelia wanted to cross the distance, to reach for him, to seek comfort in his arms. But fear held her back. Fear of rejection, of discovering that too much had changed, that the love they once shared had died along with their younger selves. Lucian must have seen the conflict in her expression. He stepped back, restoring the careful distance between them. Rest tonight. Tomorrow we begin building your defense and hunting down the truth. You are safe here, Amelia. I give you my word on that, if nothing else. He bowed formally, a gesture that felt wrong between husband and wife, and turned toward the door. But before he left, he paused and looked back at her one final time. I am glad you are alive. Whatever else has been lost between us, I am grateful beyond words that I did not truly lose you forever. Then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him, leaving Amelia alone with her thoughts and the crackling fire and the overwhelming weight of an uncertain future. The first 3 days at Cartwright Manor passed in a haze of restless sleep and waking nightmares. Amelia would jolt awake in the pre-dawn hours, her hand flying to her throat, expecting to feel the rough hemp of the noose only to find smooth skin marked with fading bruises. The weight of the Earl's death pressed upon her consciousness like a stone, made heavier by the knowledge that regardless of his treachery, a man had died by her hand, even if accidentally. She had taken a life, and that truth haunted her in the quiet moments between heartbeats. Mrs. Langford was kind but respectfully distant, providing meals and fresh clothing without pressing for conversation. The household staff moved through the manor like shadows, their curiosity about the Duke's mysterious wife evident in their sidelong glances but held in check by strict propriety. Lucian himself was conspicuously absent, conducting his business behind the closed doors of his study, emerging only for solitary meals taken in silence. On the 4th morning, Amelia could no longer bear the confinement of her chamber. She dressed in one of the simple day gowns Mrs. Langford had provided, a dove-grey creation that hung slightly loose on her frame after weeks of prison rations, and ventured into the manor's corridors. She wandered without purpose at first, simply trying to orient herself in this grand house that was supposedly her home by virtue of a marriage license signed in secret so many years ago. She discovered the library quite by accident, drawn by the scent of old leather and paper that seeped beneath a partially open door. The room took her breath away. Floor-to-ceiling shelves lined 3 walls, packed with volumes that spoke of generations of collected knowledge. Tall windows dominated the 4th wall, flooding the space with autumn sunlight that turned the dust motes into dancing gold. A massive oak desk sat near the windows, its surface empty save for an inkwell and a single candle in a brass holder. Amelia stepped inside, running her fingers along the leather spines, reading titles embossed in fading gilt. Here were volumes on history and philosophy, poetry and science, travel narratives and political treatises. And there, on a lower shelf, She found what she sought without quite knowing she had been looking for it. Legal texts. Books on English law, court procedures, precedents, and judgments. She pulled down a thick volume titled The Principles of Criminal Law and Justice and carried it to the desk. If she was to clear her name, she needed to understand the legal mechanisms that could save or condemn her. She needed to know what evidence would be required, what arguments could be made, what precedents existed for cases like hers where self-defense and accusations of treason tangled together in a web of competing narratives. The hours slipped away as she read, taking notes on scraps of paper she found in the desk drawer. The language was dense and formal, but she forced herself to comprehend each passage, to understand the distinction between murder and manslaughter, between premeditation and acts committed in the heat of passion or self-preservation. She learned about the burden of proof, about the rights of peers to trial before the House of Lords, about the ways in which evidence could be challenged or corroborated. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her concentration. A young maid entered carrying a tea tray, her movements quick and efficient. She was perhaps 18, with dark curls escaping from beneath her cap and intelligent brown eyes that missed nothing. "Begging your pardon, my lady. Mrs. Langford thought you might like some refreshment." The maid set the tray on a side table and curtsied, but hesitated before leaving, as though wrestling with whether to speak further. "What is your name?" Amelia asked gently, sensing the girl's internal struggle. "Charlotte Blake, my lady. I have been with the household for 2 years now, since before His Grace went missing in the war." "You may speak freely, Charlotte. If you have something to tell me, I would hear it." Charlotte glanced toward the door, then moved closer, lowering her voice to barely above a whisper. "My lady, I have a cousin who works in a tavern near the Inns of Court where the lawyers and magistrates gather. He sent word to me yesterday that there has been talk. Reginald Hammond has been making the rounds, spreading stories about you and His Grace. He is saying that the marriage license is a forgery, that His Grace is mad from his war experiences and has been deceived by a cunning murderess. He has hired investigators to dig into His Grace's past, looking for anything that might discredit him or prove him unfit to claim you as his wife." The tea grew cold as Charlotte revealed more. Hammond was not simply defending his brother's memory or his own inheritance. He was waging a campaign to destroy both Amelia and Lucian, to ensure that the truth about the Earl's treason remained buried and that his own complicity never came to light. He had money and connections, and he was using both with ruthless efficiency. "Thank you for telling me this, Charlotte. Your loyalty will not be forgotten." Amelia kept her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her stomach. Charlotte curtsied and departed, leaving Amelia alone with her racing thoughts and the legal texts that suddenly seemed inadequate against the force of Hammond's determination. She returned to her reading with renewed urgency, knowing now that time was not on their side. The sun had set and candles had been lit when she finally heard footsteps in the corridor outside. She knew without looking that it was Lucian. She had become attuned to his presence over these few days, could distinguish his measured tread from that of the servants. He appeared in the doorway, pausing when he saw her at the desk surrounded by open books and scattered notes. Something flickered across his face that might have been approval or simply surprise. "You have been here all day. Mrs. Langford was concerned when you missed dinner. I needed to understand the law if I am to mount any defense against the charges that still hang over me." Amelia gestured to the books spread before her. "And I have learned disturbing news from Charlotte Blake. Reginald Hammond is not idle. He is actively working to discredit both of us." Lucian entered fully, closing the door behind him. He moved to the window, looking out at the darkened grounds, his reflection ghostly in the glass. "I am aware of Hammond's activities. I have my own sources in London. He is dangerous because he is desperate. Men who stand to lose everything often become capable of things they would never have contemplated in more secure circumstances." Then we must move quickly. The legal texts suggest that if we can prove the Earl's treason, it would provide justification for my actions. Self-defense in the prevention of a capital crime against the Crown carries significant weight in law. I have been thinking along similar lines. Lucian turned from the window to face her. I have contacts in military intelligence who owe me favors for my service in the colonies. I have sent word requesting their assistance in tracing the Earl's correspondence and identifying his co-conspirators. If we can build an irrefutable case of treason, Hammond's accusations against you collapse. They stood in silence for a moment, the candlelight casting dancing shadows across the bookshelves. Then Amelia asked the question that had been weighing on her since their conversation in her chamber. What happened to you during those 3 years you were held captive? You do not have to tell me, but I would understand better if I knew what you endured. Lucian's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he would refuse to answer. But then he moved to the desk and sat in the chair opposite hers, no longer maintaining the careful distance he had preserved since bringing her to the manor. They kept us in a fortress in the mountains, far from any hope of rescue. The conditions were brutal, designed to break our spirits as much as our bodies. Men died from disease, from starvation, from simple despair. I survived by holding on to one thought above all others: that somewhere in England, you were alive and safe, and that if I could just endure long enough, I would find my way back to you. His voice was quiet but steady, as though recounting facts rather than horrors. When I finally escaped with 2 other survivors, we had to travel hundreds of miles through hostile territory with no supplies and no maps. One of my companions died of fever. The other was killed by bandits. I reached a British outpost more dead than alive, and spent months recovering before I was strong enough to make the voyage home. By then, I had been declared dead, my estate frozen in probate, and you had been married off to save your family from ruin. Amelia reached across the desk and placed her hand over his. The gesture was tentative, uncertain, but he did not pull away. Instead, his fingers curled around hers, holding on as though she were an anchor in a storm. I am sorry for what you suffered. And I am sorry that you returned to find everything changed, your sacrifice seemingly for nothing. Not for nothing. His grey eyes met hers with an intensity that stole her breath. I came back to find you facing the gallows. Yes. But I also came back in time to save you. Perhaps that was what I endured all those horrors for, Amelia. To be here, in this moment, when you needed me most. The air between them shifted, charged with possibility and the tentative beginning of something that might, in time, grow into trust and perhaps even the rekindling of what they had once shared. They sat together in the candlelit library, hands joined across the desk, 2 people scarred by time and circumstance beginning the slow, careful work of finding their way back to each other. The revelation came on the 6th morning of Amelia's residence at Cartwright Manor. She had been awake since dawn, pacing her chamber as memories of that terrible night replayed in her mind with relentless clarity. The Earl's study. The hidden compartment. The letters that had condemned him and, ultimately, destroyed her life as well. She had not told Lucian everything during their conversation in the library. There was one crucial detail she had withheld, not from distrust but from the paralyzing fear that the evidence might have been lost or destroyed. But if by some miracle it still existed, if she could retrieve what she had hidden in those frantic moments before Reginald Hammond had arrived, then they would have more than legal theories and circumstantial arguments. They would have proof. She found Lucian in his study, papers spread across his desk, his expression focused and intent. He looked up as she entered, and whatever he saw in her face made him rise immediately. I did not tell you everything about the night the Earl died. The words tumbled out before her courage could fail. When I found the treasonous letters in his desk, I took more than just the few pages I confronted him with. There was an entire packet of correspondence, coded messages written in French, maps showing military installations and supply routes, names of co-conspirators both in England and abroad. In the moments after he fell, before I called for help, I hid them. Lucian moved around the desk, his full attention fixed on her. Where did you hide them, Amelia? In the lining of my travelling trunk, the one I brought with me when I married the Earl. It was stored in my dressing room, largely forgotten because I had no occasion to travel. When Reginald Hammond orchestrated my arrest, everything happened so quickly. I was dragged from the house within hours, given no opportunity to gather personal belongings. The trunk should still be there, unless it has been destroyed or discarded. Then we must retrieve it immediately. Lucian was already moving, pulling on his coat, his movements sharp with renewed purpose. I will send men to the Earl's London residence today under the pretense of collecting your personal effects, as is my right as your husband. If Hammond protests, we will invoke legal authority. That trunk and its contents could be the key to everything. Within the hour, a carriage had been dispatched with 2 trusted footmen and a letter bearing Lucian's ducal seal. The waiting that followed was agony. Amelia could not eat, could not read, could only pace the library while Lucian maintained a vigil at the window, his jaw set in grim determination. The carriage returned as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the horizon. The footman carried between them a modest trunk of worn leather, its brass fittings tarnished with age. Amelia's hands trembled as she directed them to place it on the library floor. Lucian dismissed the servants and locked the door behind them before kneeling beside the trunk. Amelia's fingers worked at the familiar catches, then carefully pried at the silk lining of the lid's interior. The fabric tore easily, revealing the shallow space between lining and wood. And there, pressed flat and yellowed with time, lay the packet of letters exactly as she had hidden them months ago. Lucian spread the documents across his desk with meticulous care. Letters written in French detailing payments to foreign agents. Coded messages that referenced destabilizing the young Queen's government. Maps marked with locations of armories and garrison positions. A list of names, some she recognized as prominent members of Parliament, others unknown to her. The evidence was damning and comprehensive, a conspiracy that reached far beyond one traitorous earl. This is more extensive than I imagined. Lucian's voice was tight with controlled fury as he examined each document. This was not simply one man's treachery. This was a coordinated plot involving multiple conspirators at the highest levels of society and government. Which is precisely why Reginald Hammond is so desperate to silence me. He knows what I discovered. He was likely complicit in his brother's schemes, and now he fears exposure. Lucian gathered the documents carefully, his mind clearly racing through possibilities and strategies. I need to bring in someone I trust completely, someone with the expertise to analyze these documents and help us understand the full scope of the conspiracy. Captain Tobias Stanfield served with me in the colonies. He is currently stationed in London and has connections within military intelligence. If anyone can help us trace these threads and build an irrefutable case, it is Tobias. A message was sent by courier that very evening. Captain Stanfield arrived 2 days later, a tall man with sandy hair and sharp blue eyes that assessed everything with military precision. He greeted Lucian with the easy familiarity of men who had faced death together, then bowed respectfully to Amelia with genuine warmth. "Your Grace has told me something of your circumstances, my lady. I am honored to be of service in seeking justice on your behalf." The 3 of them spent the following days closeted in the library, analyzing the documents, cross-referencing names and locations, building a comprehensive picture of the conspiracy. Tobias proved invaluable, his methodical mind identifying patterns and connections that might have otherwise gone unnoticed. He confirmed that several of the names on the list were known to military intelligence as suspected sympathizers with foreign powers seeking to undermine British interests. "We have enough here to bring charges of treason against at least 6 individuals, including the late Earl and, I suspect, his brother Reginald Hammond. Tobias leaned back in his chair, satisfaction evident in his expression. The question now is how to present this evidence to the Crown in a manner that ensures it is taken seriously and acted upon swiftly. We need an audience with the Royal Magistrate and the Lord Chancellor. Lucian's tone brooked no argument. We present the evidence formally, with full documentation and sworn testimony. Once the Crown recognizes the validity of these documents, the murder charges against Amelia become irrelevant. She will be seen as a patriot who discovered and attempted to stop a treasonous plot, not a murderess who killed her husband in cold blood. As the sun set on the third day of their intensive work, Tobias excused himself to draft a formal petition for audience at the royal court. Amelia and Lucian found themselves alone in the garden, seeking fresh air after hours in the close confines of the library. The autumn evening was crisp and clear, stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. They walked in silence along the gravel paths, past dormant flower beds and ancient hedgerows. The tension that had been building between them over these intense days of collaboration finally demanded acknowledgement. Lucian stopped near a stone bench beneath an oak tree, turning to face her. "Amelia, I need to tell you something that I should have said days ago. These past weeks of working beside you, seeing your strength and intelligence, your refusal to surrender to despair, it has reminded me of everything I loved about you 6 years ago. And I find myself falling in love with the woman you have become through all the hardships you have endured." Amelia's breath caught. She stepped closer, drawn by the raw honesty in his grey eyes. "Lucian, I have been afraid to hope that what we once shared could ever be recovered. But I feel it too, this pull between us, this sense that perhaps we are being given a second chance to find our way back to each other." He reached for her hand, and she gave it willingly. They stood there in the gathering darkness, on the precipice of something fragile and precious. Lucian leaned closer, his intention clear in the way his gaze dropped to her lips. The moment shattered as Charlotte came running from the house, her face pale with alarm. "Your Grace, my lady, Captain Stanfield says you must come at once. A messenger has arrived from London with urgent news. Reginald Hammond has petitioned the court to have His Grace declared mentally unfit and the marriage license declared fraudulent. The hearing is set for 3 days hence." The warmth fled from the garden, replaced by cold reality. Their time had run out. The battle was about to begin in earnest, and everything they had fought to build hung in the balance. The news of Reginald Hammond's legal petition cast a pall over Cartwright Manor that no amount of firelight or autumn sunshine could dispel. 3 days. They had 3 days to prepare defense against charges that Lucian was mentally unfit due to his war experiences and that their marriage license was an elaborate forgery designed to save a convicted murderess from the gallows. The audacity of Hammond's strategy was breathtaking in its calculated cruelty, and the speed with which he had moved suggested desperation born of genuine fear. Captain Tobias Stanfield worked through the night, sending urgent messages to his contacts within military intelligence and the legal establishment. By dawn, responses began trickling back, and with them came revelations that transformed their understanding of the conspiracy they faced. Tobias found Lucian and Amelia in the library, both having abandoned any pretense of sleep. He carried a leather portfolio stuffed with papers, his expression grim but energized by the thrill of the hunt. He spread documents across the desk with the precision of a military strategist laying out a battlefield map. Reginald Hammond was not simply protecting his brother's treasonous legacy or securing his inheritance. He was an active participant in the conspiracy from the beginning. Tobias tapped a finger on a decoded letter that bore the Earl's handwriting. This correspondence references payments made through an intermediary identified only as RH for services rendered in recruiting additional conspirators within Parliament. I cross-referenced this with financial records obtained from a source at the Treasury, and the amounts matched deposits made into an account held by Reginald Hammond during the same period. Amelia leaned forward, studying the evidence with the focused intensity she had developed over days of legal research. He was being paid by his own brother to expand the conspiracy, which means his motivation for silencing me goes far beyond inheritance or family loyalty. If the truth of the Earl's treason comes to light, Reginald's own complicity will be exposed. He faces execution for treason himself. Precisely. Tobias pulled out another document, this one more recent. And there is more. Hammond has not been idle since your rescue from the gallows. He has been systematically bribing court officials and hiring the most expensive lawyers in London. He has spread rumors throughout the legal community that His Grace suffered severe psychological damage during his captivity and has become prone to delusions and irrational behavior. He has suggested that you, Lady Amelia, manipulated His Grace's weakened mental state to convince him of a marriage that never legally occurred. Lucian's jaw clenched with barely controlled fury. He is building a narrative in which I am mad and Amelia is a cunning manipulator. It is a strategy designed to discredit both of us simultaneously while distracting from the real evidence of treason. The hearing in 3 days is merely the opening salvo. Tobias continued, his tone grave. Hammond intends to drag this through the courts, using delays and procedural challenges to buy time while he works to destroy your reputations and, I suspect, to eliminate the physical evidence we have gathered. Men who commit treason rarely hesitate to commit other crimes when their lives are at stake. As if summoning confirmation of Tobias's warning, Mrs. Langford appeared at the library door, her usually composed face tight with concern. She carried a letter on a silver tray, the paper expensive cream stock sealed with blood-red wax bearing no identifying mark. This was left at the servants' entrance this morning, my lady. The boy who delivered it ran off before anyone could question him. Amelia took the letter with steady hands despite the dread coiling in her stomach. She broke the seal and unfolded the single page, reading words written in an elegant copperplate script that betrayed no hint of the malice behind them. Lady Thornefield, you have made a grave error in believing the Duke of Ashmore can protect you. His time in captivity has left him broken and unreliable. The courts will see this truth, and when they do, you will find yourself once again facing the gallows, but this time with no miraculous rescue. However, there remains an opportunity for clemency. Recant your accusations against the late Earl. Admit to the murder publicly and throw yourself on the mercy of the court. Accept transportation to the colonies in lieu of execution. Do this, and you will live. Continue your current course, and neither you nor the Duke will survive what is coming. You have until the hearing to decide. Choose wisely. The letter was unsigned, but the sender's identity was unmistakable. Amelia handed it to Lucian without comment, watching his expression darken as he read. When he finished, he crumpled the paper in his fist, his control finally cracking to reveal the rage beneath. Hammond has revealed his hand completely now. This is not merely a legal battle. He is threatening our lives directly. He knows we have evidence of the conspiracy, and he knows that evidence will destroy him. So he offers a devil's bargain. Your life in exchange for your silence and exile, with the implicit threat that refusal means death for both of us. Tobias took the crumpled letter, smoothing it carefully and adding it to his growing collection of evidence. This letter is itself proof of conspiracy and witness intimidation. Hammond has made a tactical error born of desperation. He should have remained within the bounds of legal maneuvering, but instead he has threatened a peer of the realm and his wife directly. This gives us additional leverage. Amelia rose from her chair and moved to the window, staring out at the peaceful grounds that now felt more like a gilded cage than a sanctuary. We are running out of time. Hammond will not wait passively for the hearing. He will strike before then if he believes we pose an imminent threat. And he has resources we cannot match, not in the short term. Money, connections, the ability to bribe officials and hire assassins if necessary. Then we must move faster than he anticipates. Lucian joined her at the window, his presence solid and reassuring despite the danger closing around them. Tobias, how quickly can you arrange an emergency audience with the Lord Chancellor? Not the formal hearing Hammond has scheduled, but a private meeting where we can present our evidence directly to someone with the authority to act immediately. I can try through my military contacts. The Lord Chancellor served in the army in his youth and maintains relationships with senior officers. If I can reach him through those channels, bypassing the civilian legal system that Hammond has been working to corrupt, we might secure an audience within 24 hours. Do it. Send messages under military seal, emphasize the national security implications of the treason evidence we possess. Make it clear that this goes far beyond a domestic murder case and touches on threats to the crown itself. Tobias departed immediately, leaving Lucian and Amelia alone in the library. The morning light streaming through the windows seemed incongruously cheerful given the darkness of their circumstances. Amelia felt the weight of exhaustion pressing down on her, the accumulated stress of weeks of terror and uncertainty finally demanding its price. I am frightened, Lucian. The admission came quietly, honestly, stripped of any pretense of bravery. Not for myself alone, though the thought of returning to that gallows haunts my nightmares. But I am frightened for you, for what Hammond might do to destroy you because you chose to save me. Perhaps I should accept his offer. Perhaps my silence and exile would be a small price to pay for your safety. Lucian turned her to face him, his hands firm on her shoulders, his grey eyes blazing with an intensity that left no room for doubt. Do not even consider such a thing. We face this together, Amelia. Together, as we should have faced everything these past 6 years if fate had not torn us apart. I did not survive 3 years of captivity and another 2 years of hell finding my way home just to surrender you to that bastard's threats. We have evidence, we have allies, and we have the truth on our side. That must be enough. And if it is not enough? If Hammond's money and connections prove stronger than truth and evidence? Then we fight with everything we have until there is nothing left to fight with. But I will not let him take you from me again, Amelia. I swear this on my life and my honor. She leaned into him then, allowing herself a moment of weakness, of seeking comfort in his strength. His arms came around her, holding her close, and she could feel the steady beat of his heart against her cheek. Whatever came next, whatever dangers Hammond might unleash, they would face it together. That would have to be enough. The hours that followed were a blur of frantic preparation. Tobias returned with cautiously optimistic news. His military contacts had reached the Lord Chancellor's private secretary, and an emergency audience had been granted for the following afternoon. They would have one opportunity to present their evidence directly to one of the most powerful men in England, bypassing Hammond's corrupted legal channels entirely. They spent the evening organizing documents, preparing arguments, anticipating challenges and objections. Tobias coached them on courtroom protocol and the Lord Chancellor's known preferences for how evidence should be presented. Amelia rehearsed her testimony, recounting the night of the Earl's death with as much clinical detachment as she could muster. As midnight approached and Tobias finally retired to the guest chambers, Lucian walked Amelia to her door. They stood in the corridor, neither quite ready to part despite the exhaustion that made every movement an effort. Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know something. Lucian's voice was low, meant only for her ears. These past days working beside you, seeing your courage and intelligence, your refusal to break under impossible pressure, it has shown me that the woman I married 6 years ago has become someone even more remarkable. I loved the girl you were then. But I am falling in love with the woman you have become, Amelia. And regardless of what the Lord Chancellor decides, regardless of what Hammond does, that truth remains constant. Amelia reached up and touched his scarred cheek, feeling the rasp of his evening stubble beneath her fingertips. I have been afraid to hope, afraid to believe that what we lost could ever be recovered. But I hope now, Lucian. I hope that when this nightmare is finally over, we might find our way back to each other and build something even stronger than what we had before." He turned his head and pressed a kiss to her palm, a gesture of such tenderness that it brought tears to her eyes. Then he stepped back, maintaining the careful propriety they had preserved throughout her stay despite the growing pull between them. "Sleep if you can. Tomorrow we begin the fight in earnest, and I need you sharp and ready beside me." Amelia nodded and slipped into her chamber, closing the door softly behind her. But sleep did not come easily. She lay in the darkness, listening to the old house settle around her, and thought about Hammond somewhere in London, plotting their destruction. She thought about the Lord Chancellor and whether one man's judgment would be enough to overcome the conspiracy arrayed against them. She thought about Lucian and the fragile, precious thing growing between them that deserved a chance to flourish. And she prayed that tomorrow would bring justice rather than the final destruction Hammond had promised. The mysterious visitor arrived at Cartwright Manor just after dawn, when the household was still quiet and the morning mist clung to the grounds like a shroud. Mrs. Langford woke Lucian with urgent news that a lady claiming vital information about Reginald Hammond demanded immediate audience. The woman had arrived alone in a hired carriage, veiled and cloaked, refusing to give her name to anyone but the Duke himself. Lucian dressed quickly and descended to the drawing-room where the stranger waited. Amelia, roused by the commotion, followed close behind despite Mrs. Langford's protests about propriety. When they entered, the woman rose from her seat and lifted her veil, revealing a face of striking beauty marred by exhaustion and what looked like a fading bruise along her jaw. She was perhaps 30, with dark hair swept back in an elegant chignon and intelligent hazel eyes that assessed them both with the practiced wariness of someone who had learned to trust no one. Her traveling dress was expensive but deliberately unremarkable, chosen to avoid attracting attention. She carried herself with the bearing of nobility, though tension radiated from her like heat from a forge. "Your Grace, Lady Amelia, forgive my dramatic arrival. I am Lady Rosalind Hammond, wife to Reginald Hammond, though I use that title with considerable reluctance. I have information that may prove vital to your cause, but I must have your assurance that what I reveal will be held in strictest confidence until the appropriate moment." Lucian gestured for her to sit, studying her with the careful assessment of a military officer evaluating potential allies or threats. "You have traveled alone and in secret to offer testimony against your own husband. That suggests either genuine conviction or an elaborate trap. Which is it, Lady Hammond?" Rosalind's laugh was bitter and sharp. "I despise my husband, Your Grace. I have despised him since 6 months into our arranged marriage when I discovered the true nature of his character. He is cruel, greedy, and utterly without conscience. I have remained in the marriage only because leaving would have meant financial ruin and social exile. But his recent actions have crossed a line I cannot ignore, and I find myself willing to risk everything to see him brought to justice." She opened the reticule she carried and withdrew a small leather journal, its pages filled with neat handwriting. "This is a record I have kept for the past 3 years of every suspicious meeting, every questionable financial transaction, every whispered conversation I have overheard. My husband believes me to be a decorative fool, concerned only with fashion and gossip. He does not know that I have been documenting his crimes with meticulous care, waiting for the moment when that documentation might serve a purpose." Tobias was summoned from his chambers and arrived still fastening his uniform jacket. He took the journal with reverent care, immediately recognizing its potential value. As he paged through it, his expression grew increasingly animated. Names, dates, amounts of money changing hands, locations of clandestine meetings. It was a treasure trove of evidence that corroborated and expanded upon everything they had already discovered. "This is extraordinary, Lady Hammond. With this journal and the documents we already possess, We can trace the conspiracy back through years of activity. We can identify every conspirator, every bribed official, every treasonous act. This changes everything." Rosalind's expression remained carefully neutral, though relief flickered in her eyes. "There is more I can tell you. My husband has been meeting with several members of Parliament who are complicit in the conspiracy. Lord Stanfield, though no relation to the captain here, has been receiving regular payments in exchange for using his position on military oversight committees to leak sensitive information. Sir Charles Langford has been facilitating communications between the conspirators and foreign agents through his shipping interests. There are at least 4 others whose names I can provide." Amelia, who had been listening intently, moved forward with a sudden clarity of purpose. "Lady Hammond, your testimony before the Lord Chancellor this afternoon would be devastating to your husband's case. You are his wife, a witness to his private actions and conversations. Your word carries legal weight that our evidence alone might lack. Will you stand with us and testify to what you know?" Rosalind met Amelia's gaze, and something passed between them, an understanding born of shared experience with powerful men who believed themselves above consequence. "I will testify, Lady Amelia. I will tell the Lord Chancellor everything I have witnessed and documented. My marriage is already destroyed beyond repair. My reputation will be in tatters regardless of what I do. I might as well ensure that my husband pays for his crimes rather than allowing him to destroy innocent people to protect himself." The morning was spent in intensive preparation. Rosalind provided detailed accounts of specific incidents, dates, and conversations that added crucial context to the documentary evidence. She described how Reginald had celebrated the Earl's death not as a brother mourning a sibling, but as a co-conspirator relieved to have a potential liability eliminated. She revealed his cold calculation in framing Amelia, his complete lack of remorse, his certainty that money and influence would allow him to escape justice. As noon approached, Tobias departed for London to finalize arrangements for the Lord Chancellor's audience and to ensure that Lady Rosalind's presence would be accommodated. The women remained behind with Lucian, the atmosphere charged with nervous energy and cautious hope. Amelia found herself energized rather than paralyzed by the approaching confrontation. She had spent weeks as a victim, powerless and afraid, but now she was reclaiming her agency. She contributed strategic suggestions about how to present the evidence, identified potential weaknesses in their case and proposed solutions, and helped Rosalind prepare for the intense questioning she would face. Lucian watched her with undisguised admiration, seeing not the frightened woman he had rescued from the gallows, but a formidable ally whose intelligence and courage had been forged in the fires of injustice. When Rosalind excused herself to rest before the afternoon's ordeal, he and Amelia found themselves alone in the garden where their earlier moment had been interrupted. The autumn afternoon was crisp and clear, the grounds golden with falling leaves. They walked without speaking at first, simply enjoying the brief respite before the storm. When they reached the stone bench beneath the oak tree, Lucian stopped and turned to face her. "I need to say this now, before we go into battle this afternoon, because I may not have another chance." His voice was rough with emotion barely held in check. "I never stopped loving you, Amelia. Not during the 3 years of captivity when your memory was the only thing that kept me sane. Not during the long journey home when I did not know if you still lived. Not when I learned you had married another, believing me dead. And not now, when I see you transformed by suffering into someone even more remarkable than the woman I first loved." Amelia's breath caught, tears pricking at her eyes. "Lucian, I mourned you as truly as if I had stood at your grave. When they forced me to marry the Earl, I felt like I was betraying your memory even though I knew you were gone. But my heart never truly belonged to him. It remained yours, even when I thought you lost forever." He reached for her then, pulling her close with a desperation that spoke of too many years apart, too many near losses. She came willingly, her arms wrapping around his neck as his mouth found hers in a kiss that was both tender and fierce, claiming and surrendering simultaneously. It tasted of salt from her tears and carried the weight of all the years they had been denied this simple communion. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Lucian rested his forehead against hers. "When this is over, when you are truly free and safe, I want to court you properly. I want to give you the wedding you deserved 6 years ago instead of that hurried secret ceremony. I want to build a life with you, Amelia, based not on old promises but on who we have become. I want that too. I want the chance to know you again, to learn who you are now, to build something new and strong together. But first, we must survive this afternoon and face down the men who would destroy us. Then let us go to London and show Reginald Hammond and his conspirators that they have underestimated us. Let us show them that truth and courage can triumph over corruption and greed." They returned to the manor hand in hand, their relationship fundamentally transformed by honesty and hope. Whatever the afternoon brought, they would face it together, as partners in every sense, bound not just by legal documents but by choice and love reforged in adversity's crucible. The attack came in the darkest hour before dawn, when even the most vigilant guards fought against the pull of sleep and the manor lay wrapped in silence. Amelia had retired late after a long evening spent finalizing their presentation for the Lord Chancellor, her mind too restless for true rest. She stood at her chamber window in her nightgown and dressing robe, watching the moon cast silver shadows across the grounds, when she saw the first flicker of movement near the tree line. At first, she thought it a trick of light or perhaps a deer wandering from the forest. But then she saw another shadow detach from the darkness, and another, moving with the coordinated precision of trained fighters rather than the random wandering of animals. Her blood turned to ice as understanding crashed over her. They were under attack. She ran from her chamber without thought for propriety or safety, her bare feet silent on the corridor's carpeted floor. She burst into Lucian's room without knocking, finding him already half-dressed, his military instincts having roused him at some subliminal alarm she had not consciously perceived. Armed men are approaching from the forest. At least a dozen, possibly more. They are moving in formation, surrounding the manor. Her voice was steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. Lucian's expression hardened into the mask of a battlefield commander. He finished dressing with swift efficiency, strapping on weapons that he had clearly kept close at hand despite the supposed safety of his own home. "Wake Tobias and Mrs. Langford. Tell them to rouse the household and gather everyone in the main hall. Bar all ground floor windows and doors. Move quickly but quietly. We cannot let them know we are aware of their approach." Amelia flew down the corridor, her practical mind already organizing the chaos into actionable steps. She woke Tobias first, delivering her message in terse whispers that had him armed and moving within seconds. Mrs. Langford took longer to rouse but proved admirably calm once she understood the danger. Within minutes, the household staff were being quietly assembled, their faces pale with fear but their movements controlled. Charlotte appeared at Amelia's side, her young face set with determination. "My lady, I can help. Tell me what needs doing." Help Mrs. Langford move the younger maids to the cellars. Then gather all the medical supplies you can find and bring them to the main hall. We may have wounded before this night is through. Amelia surprised herself with the authority in her voice, with the way her mind had shifted from panic to purposeful action. Lucian and Tobias had armed several of the male servants and positioned them at key points throughout the manor's ground floor. The house had been built in an earlier century when such defenses were necessary, with thick walls and narrow windows that could be easily defended. Lucian moved among the men with quiet words of instruction and encouragement, his presence alone steadying their nerves. Amelia found herself in the main hall, which had been designated as their command center and aid station. She tore strips from linen tablecloths to make bandages, boiled water in the great fireplace, and laid out the medical supplies Charlotte had gathered with the same methodical care she had once applied to managing the Earl's household. If violence came, they would be as prepared as possible to deal with its aftermath. The first assault came with shocking violence. A volley of stones shattered several windows simultaneously, followed immediately by the crash of something heavy against the main doors. Shouts erupted from outside, men's voices raised in coordination, and the siege began in earnest. Lucian had anticipated that the attackers would try to force entry through the main doors and had reinforced them with furniture barricades. The heavy oak held against the first assault, then the second. But on the third strike, the wood began to splinter. Tobias and 3 footmen held position behind the barricade, weapons ready, waiting for the inevitable breach. Amelia moved through the manor with focused purpose, checking on defensive positions, bringing water and ammunition to the men, her fear transmuted into useful action. She climbed to the second-floor gallery overlooking the entrance hall, giving her a vantage point to observe the unfolding battle. From there, she could see patterns in the attack that those in the midst of fighting might miss. They are concentrating their forces on the main doors and the east wing windows, but I see no one approaching from the west side. She called down to Lucian, her voice cutting through the chaos. It could be a weakness in their planning, or it could be a feint to draw our defenders away from their true point of entry. Lucian processed this information with the speed of a trained tactician. Tobias, take 2 men and check the west wing. Lady Hammond, stay with Mrs. Langford in the cellars. But Rosalind had already emerged, having armed herself with a heavy poker from one of the fireplaces, her expression fierce. The eastern windows gave way under sustained assault, and mercenaries began pouring through. These were not common criminals or hired thugs. They moved with military precision, well-armed and clearly experienced in such work. The manor's defenders met them with desperate courage, and the entrance hall became a scene of brutal close combat. Amelia watched in horror as one of the footmen fell, blood spreading across his livery. Without thinking, she ran down the stairs, heedless of her own safety, and helped drag the wounded man back toward the main hall where her makeshift aid station waited. Charlotte appeared at her side, and together they stanched the bleeding, their hands steady despite the violence raging mere yards away. It was Charlotte who noticed him. One of the newer footmen, a man named James who had been hired only weeks before, was moving toward the servants' entrance with furtive purpose. Charlotte's sharp eyes caught the glint of a key in his hand, and understanding dawned with sickening clarity. "My lady, that man is going to unlock the door and let them in." Charlotte's voice was urgent but controlled. Amelia did not hesitate. She grabbed the poker that Rosalind had discarded and ran toward the servants' corridor, Charlotte close behind. James had already reached the door and was turning the key when Amelia's voice rang out. "Stop where you are, traitor." James whirled, his hand going to a knife at his belt, his face twisting with malicious intent. "Hammond promised me enough gold to live like a lord if I helped him. You are already dead, my lady. You just do not know it yet." He yanked the door open, but Charlotte was faster than he anticipated. She threw herself at his legs, bringing him down in a tangle of limbs just as 3 mercenaries tried to push through the doorway. Amelia swung the poker with all her strength, catching the first man across the temple and sending him stumbling backward into his companions. She slammed the door shut and threw the bolt home, her heart hammering wildly. 2 of the male servants arrived, having heard the commotion, and dragged the struggling James away. Charlotte stood, her dress torn and her lip bleeding from where the traitor had struck her, but her eyes blazed with triumph. "Well done, my lady. You fight like a warrior." But there was no time for congratulations. The sounds of combat from the entrance hall had intensified, and Amelia could hear Lucian's voice raised in command. She ran back toward the fighting, arriving just as Tobias led a counterattack that drove the invading mercenaries back through the shattered windows. The defenders pressed their advantage, following the attackers outside where Lucian had positioned additional men. The mercenaries, caught between two forces and realizing their inside accomplice had failed, began to break and run. Some were captured in the chaotic melee, others fled into the darkness from which they had emerged. But in the confusion, Amelia became separated from the main group. She found herself near the garden entrance, disoriented by smoke and shadows, when a hand clamped over her mouth from behind and a blade pressed cold against her throat. "Do not scream, Lady Thornefield, or I will open your throat here and now." The voice was rough and accented, belonging to one of the mercenaries who had circled around during the retreat. "You are coming with me. Hammond wants you alive for now, though I suspect that will not last long once he has finished with you." He began dragging her backward toward the tree line. Amelia struggled, but his grip was iron, the blade never wavering. Terror clawed at her throat, but beneath it rose a fierce determination. She had not survived the gallows and the past weeks of hell only to be taken so easily. She went limp suddenly, making herself dead weight. The mercenary cursed and adjusted his grip, and in that moment of distraction, Amelia drove her elbow back into his ribs with all her strength. His hold loosened just enough for her to twist away from the blade, and she screamed with everything she had. "Lucian!" The mercenary's hand shot out, catching her arm in a bruising grip. He yanked her back, raising the knife for a strike that would end her resistance permanently. But then a shadow moved in the darkness with impossible speed, and Lucian was there, his sword catching the descending blade and turning it aside. The fight was brief and savage. Lucian moved with the lethal grace of a man who had survived countless battles, his every action economical and precise. Within seconds, the mercenary lay disarmed and unconscious at his feet. Lucian's arms came around Amelia, pulling her against his chest, his heart hammering as wildly as her own. "Are you hurt? Did he harm you?" His hands moved over her, checking for injuries, his voice rough with fear that had no place on a battlefield but consumed him entirely when it came to her safety. "I am unharmed." Shaken, but unharmed. She clung to him, allowing herself this moment of weakness now that the immediate danger had passed. Tobias appeared with several men, surveying the scene with grim satisfaction. "We have captured 6 of the attackers. The rest fled. The manor is secure, though we have 3 wounded among our people and extensive damage to the windows and doors." As dawn began to break over Cartwright Manor, the full scope of the night's violence became apparent. The entrance hall was a wreck of broken furniture and shattered glass. Blood stained the marble floors. But they had survived, and more importantly, they had captured prisoners who might be persuaded to testify about who had hired them. Amelia worked through the morning tending to the wounded with Charlotte's able assistance, her hand steady despite exhaustion. She had discovered reserves of courage and capability she had not known she possessed. She was no longer the terrified woman standing on the gallows awaiting death. She was a survivor, a fighter, someone who would not be easily broken or intimidated. When the last wound had been bandaged and the prisoner secured, Lucian found her in the wrecked entrance hall, staring at the damage with an expression he could not quite read. "Hammond has shown his hand completely now. He sent killers to murder us in our own home because he knows we are close to exposing him. This attack is itself evidence of his guilt and desperation." Amelia turned to him, and he saw not fear in her emerald eyes but steely determination. "Then let us finish this. Let us go to the Lord Chancellor today as planned and lay everything before him. The evidence, Lady Rosalind's testimony, and now we can add attempted murder to the charges against Reginald Hammond. Let us end this game once and for all." Lucian took her hand, their fingers intertwining, and felt pride swell in his chest. "Together, then. We finish this together." The morning after the siege found Cartwright Manor transformed into something resembling a military encampment. Additional guards had been hired from among Tobias's trusted former soldiers, and they patrolled the grounds with loaded weapons and watchful eyes. The shattered windows had been boarded over, giving the once elegant manor a fortress-like appearance that matched its current purpose. Inside, the household moved with quiet efficiency, cleaning blood from marble floors and removing the physical evidence of violence while the emotional scars remained fresh and raw. Lucian had not slept. He stood in his study, staring at maps of London and lists of names, his mind racing through scenarios and contingencies with the relentless focus of a general planning for battle. But beneath the tactical thinking lay a current of fear that threatened to overwhelm his carefully maintained control. The moment when he had seen that mercenary's blade at Amelia's throat kept replaying in his mind with vivid, sickening clarity. He had been seconds away from losing her, from watching her die before his eyes after all they had survived. When Amelia entered the study mid-morning, dressed in a simple traveling gown of deep blue, her auburn hair pinned up with practical efficiency, Lucian felt his resolve crystallize into something he knew she would fight against but which he felt compelled to voice nonetheless. "I want you to remain here at the manor today when we go to present our case before the Lord Chancellor. Tobias, Lady Rosalind, and I can handle the presentation. You will be safer here, protected by the guards, away from whatever Hammond might attempt in London." Amelia's expression did not change, but something hardened in her emerald eyes. She closed the study door behind her with deliberate care and crossed to stand before his desk, her posture straight and unyielding. "No, Lucian. I appreciate your desire to protect me, truly I do. But I will not hide while others fight my battles. This began with me, with my discovery of the Earl's treason and his death at my hands, however accidental. My name is the one dragged through the mud, my neck that nearly stretched at the gallows. I will not cower in safety while you risk everything to clear my reputation. I am going to London, and I am standing before the Lord Chancellor to tell my story in my own words. Amelia, be reasonable. Hammond has already sent killers to this house. In London, surrounded by crowds and chaos, the opportunities for another attempt on your life multiply exponentially. I cannot protect you effectively in that environment. Then do not protect me. Trust me instead to protect myself, as I did last night when I fought off that traitor at the servants' entrance and screamed loudly enough to bring help when that mercenary grabbed me. I am not the helpless victim you rescued from the gallows anymore, Lucian. These past weeks have forged me into something different, something stronger. Do not diminish that by treating me like fragile porcelain that must be locked away for safekeeping." The words hit him with the force of physical blows, not because they were cruel but because they were true. He had been so consumed with fear of losing her that he had failed to see how profoundly she had changed, how the trial she had endured had revealed reserves of courage and capability that demanded respect rather than protection. "You are right, and I apologize for attempting to sideline you from your own vindication. You have earned the right to face your accusers and tell your truth directly. I will stand beside you when you do, but I will not stand in your way." Relief and something deeper, more profound, softened Amelia's expression. She moved around the desk and took his hands in hers, feeling the calluses earned in war and captivity, understanding now that this man had his own scars and fears that shaped his actions. "I need you beside me, not in front of me shielding me from the world. We are partners in this, equal partners. That is how we survive what comes next." Their moment of reconciliation was interrupted by a knock at the study door. Lady Rosalind entered, and the exhaustion evident in her face spoke of her own sleepless night processing the violence and her decision to betray her husband. But her eyes held a fierce light that suggested her resolve had only strengthened. "I have something that will ensure our success today. Something I have kept hidden even from the journal I already provided, because I knew its revelation would mark the point of no return in my marriage and perhaps my life." She placed a small leather-bound ledger on Lucian's desk, its cover worn from handling, its pages filled with columns of numbers and notations in Reginald Hammond's own distinctive handwriting. This is my husband's personal accounting ledger. He keeps it locked in a safe in his private study, but I discovered the combination years ago and have been copying relevant pages whenever he left the house on his conspiratorial business." Tobias, who had arrived silently and stood listening in the doorway, moved forward to examine the ledger with the hungry intensity of a man who recognized the significance of what he was seeing. His fingers traced the columns, cross-referencing dates and amounts with information already in their possession. "This is extraordinary. These payments correspond exactly to known dates when foreign agents were active in London. These notations reference riots that were incited in manufacturing districts last year, riots that were attributed to labor unrest but which we now can prove were deliberately orchestrated and funded. And these names, these are members of Parliament, judges, military officers, all receiving regular payments from Hammond's personal funds. This ledger connects every thread of the conspiracy into an undeniable pattern of treason that reaches to the highest levels of society and government." Lady Rosalind's voice was steady but carried the weight of finality. "I retrieved this from the safe yesterday morning, before the attack. I knew that once I testified against my husband, there would be no possibility of returning to that house or accessing his papers again. This is the last and most damning evidence I can provide. After today, I will have nothing. No marriage, no home, no position in society. But I will have the satisfaction of knowing I helped bring a traitor to justice." Amelia moved to stand beside the other woman, taking her hand in a gesture of solidarity and respect. "You will have more than satisfaction. You will have friends who honor your courage, and you will have the knowledge that you chose righteousness over comfort and truth over complicity. Those are riches that no amount of gold or social standing can purchase." The morning passed in intense preparation. The ledger's entries were cross-referenced with other evidence, creating a comprehensive narrative of conspiracy that spanned years and implicated dozens of powerful individuals. They rehearsed their presentations, anticipated objections and challenges, and prepared responses to every argument Hammond's lawyers might raise. As noon approached and the time came to depart for London, the household gathered to see them off. Mrs. Langford had tears in her eyes as she embraced Amelia, whispering a prayer for their safety and success. Charlotte stood with the other servants, her young face set with determination, the bruise on her jaw from the previous night's fighting worn like a badge of honor. The carriage journey to London was tense and silent, each of them lost in private thoughts about what the afternoon would bring. Lucian held Amelia's hand throughout, his grip firm and reassuring. Tobias reviewed documents one final time, his military mind running through tactical scenarios. Rosalind stared out the window at the passing countryside, watching her old life recede with each turn of the wheels. They arrived at the royal courts in late afternoon, the imposing stone building standing as a monument to British justice and law. Word of their petition had spread through the legal community, and the corridors were crowded with barristers, solicitors, and curious observers eager to witness what promised to be a sensational hearing. Reginald Hammond was already present, surrounded by an expensive cadre of lawyers in silk and wool. His face twisted with barely controlled rage when he saw Rosalind among their party, understanding immediately what her presence meant. His eyes found Amelia next, and the hatred there was palpable, a living thing that promised violence should he ever get within striking distance. The Lord Chancellor's chambers were austere and imposing, designed to intimidate those who stood before the highest legal authority in the land. Lord Chancellor Thomas Ashworth was a man in his 60s, with iron-grey hair and penetrating blue eyes that had witnessed decades of humanity's best and worst impulses. He sat behind a massive oak desk, his expression neutral but his attention focused completely on the parties before him. "We are here to address the petition brought by Reginald Hammond seeking to have the marriage between Lucian Cartwright, Duke of Ashmore, and Lady Amelia Thornefield declared invalid on grounds of fraud and mental incapacity. We are also here to address countercharges brought by the Duke alleging conspiracy, treason, attempted murder, and witness intimidation. These are grave matters that touch upon national security and the integrity of our justice system. I will hear evidence from all parties, and I will render judgment based on law and truth, not on wealth or influence. Let us proceed. The battle for justice had begun, and everything they had fought for hung in the balance. Amelia squared her shoulders, met the Lord Chancellor's gaze directly, and prepared to tell her truth to power. Whatever came next, she would face it with courage, with Lucian beside her, and with the absolute certainty that they had done everything possible to ensure that justice would triumph over corruption. The price of truth had been high, paid in blood and fear and sacrifice. But as Amelia rose to give her testimony, she knew with absolute conviction that some prices were worth paying, and that truth, however costly, was always worth fighting for. The Lord Chancellor's chambers fell into absolute silence as Lucian rose to present their case. He stood with military bearing, his scarred face composed but his grey eyes burning with controlled intensity. Beside him, Amelia sat with her hands folded in her lap, her emerald eyes fixed on the Lord Chancellor with unwavering focus. Lady Rosalind occupied the chair to her left, pale but resolute. Tobias stood behind them, a solid presence representing the military authority that lent additional weight to their accusations. Across the chamber, Reginald Hammond sat surrounded by his expensive lawyers, his expression one of calculated confidence that barely masked the desperation beneath. He had wagered everything on his ability to discredit Lucian and Amelia, to bury the truth beneath legal maneuvering and purchased influence. Now, faced with the evidence arrayed against him, cracks were beginning to appear in his carefully constructed facade. Lucian began with methodical precision, laying out the chronology of events from Amelia's forced marriage to the Earl through her discovery of treason, the Earl's accidental death, and her subsequent framing for murder. He presented the marriage license that proved Amelia had been his legal wife throughout her time with the Earl, rendering that union invalid from its inception. He detailed his own return from presumed death and his investigation into the circumstances surrounding the Earl's demise. Then came the documentary evidence. The treasonous letters Amelia had hidden in her trunk were presented one by one, each carefully authenticated and translated where necessary. Maps showing military installations and supply routes meant for foreign powers. Coded correspondence discussing payments and coordination with enemy agents. A list of co-conspirators that read like a directory of influential men across Parliament, the courts, and military administration. The Lord Chancellor examined each document with meticulous care, his expression growing increasingly grave as the scope of the conspiracy revealed itself. These were not allegations that could be dismissed or explained away. This was comprehensive, damning proof of a treasonous network that had operated for years beneath the surface of respectable society. Lady Rosalind was called to testify next. She rose with dignity despite the tremor in her hands, and her voice carried clearly through the chamber as she recounted years of witnessing her husband's criminal activities. She described conversations overheard, meetings observed, the journal she had kept documenting dates and details that corroborated every piece of documentary evidence. Her testimony was devastating in its specificity, impossible to dismiss as the ramblings of a vengeful wife when every detail aligned perfectly with independent evidence. Then she produced Reginald Hammond's personal ledger, and the chamber erupted in shocked murmurs that the Lord Chancellor had to silence with a sharp command. The ledger was passed to the Chancellor's examination, and even his practiced neutrality wavered as he paged through columns of payments to foreign agents, funding for orchestrated riots, bribes paid to officials and judges. This ledger appears to be in your hand, Mr. Hammond. Can you explain these entries? The Lord Chancellor's tone was deceptively mild, but the steel beneath it was unmistakable. Reginald's lawyers launched into objections about the legality of how the ledger was obtained, about privacy rights and the inadmissibility of evidence stolen from a man's private study. But the Lord Chancellor waved them aside with visible impatience. We are discussing matters of treason against the Crown, gentlemen. The niceties of property law pale in comparison to evidence of conspiracy to destabilize Her Majesty's government. Mr. Hammond, you will answer the question. Reginald rose, his face flushed with anger and growing panic. That ledger has been taken out of context. Those payments were legitimate business expenses related to my shipping interests and political contributions. My wife has always been unstable, prone to flights of fancy and vindictive behavior. She has clearly fabricated portions of her so-called journal to paint innocent activities in a sinister light. Then explain this entry from 3 months ago documenting a payment of £500 to a man named Jacques Moreau on the date when a riot broke out at the Manchester textile mills, a riot that resulted in 3 deaths and significant property damage. Military intelligence has confirmed that Moreau is a known French agent provocateur. How does that constitute a legitimate business expense? The color drained from Reginald's face. His lawyers huddled around him, whispering urgently, but the trap had closed. Every denial could be countered with specific evidence, every explanation unraveled by cross-referenced documentation. The Lord Chancellor turned his attention to Amelia. Lady Thornefield, I would hear your account of the night your husband died, in your own words and without interruption. Amelia rose, and every eye in the chamber fixed upon her. She was acutely aware of the weight of this moment, of how her words would be recorded and remembered, how they would shape not only her own fate but the resolution of a conspiracy that threatened the realm itself. She began with her discovery of the letters in the Earl's study, describing the shock and horror of realizing the man she had been forced to marry was betraying his country. She recounted the confrontation that followed, the Earl's rage at being discovered, his hands around her throat as he tried to silence her permanently. She described the desperate struggle, his accidental fall, the blood spreading across the floor as she realized he was dead. I did not murder my husband, my lord. I defended myself against a man who was attempting to kill me to protect his treasonous activities. When I tried to bring the evidence of his crimes to the authorities, his brother Reginald Hammond orchestrated my arrest and framing for murder. He planted poison in my chambers, bribed servants to give false testimony, and ensured I was convicted and sentenced to death. All of this to silence me and bury the truth about the conspiracy he himself was part of. Her voice remained steady throughout, though tears streaked her face. Not tears of weakness or plea for sympathy, but tears of righteous fury at the injustice she had endured. The Lord Chancellor listened without expression, but something in his eyes suggested he was hearing truth rather than manipulation. The hearing continued for hours as additional evidence was presented and witnesses called. The captured mercenaries from the attack on Cartwright Manor testified about being hired by Reginald Hammond to eliminate the Duke and his wife. The traitor footman, offered clemency in exchange for cooperation, confirmed that Hammond had paid him handsomely to help the attackers gain entry to the manor. As afternoon faded into evening and the weight of evidence mounted to overwhelming proportions, Reginald Hammond finally broke. His lawyers could no longer contain or spin the truth, and he seemed to realize that his only hope lay in cooperation rather than continued denial. I want immunity from prosecution in exchange for my full testimony against the other conspirators. His voice was hoarse, defeated, but still calculating even in collapse. I can give you names, dates, evidence of conspiracy reaching into the highest levels of Parliament and the military. But I will not hang for crimes I committed under the influence and direction of more powerful men who used me as their instrument. The Lord Chancellor's expression was one of cold contempt. You will receive no promises of immunity, Mr. Hammond. You will confess fully to your crimes, and the Crown will determine what mercy, if any, you deserve based on the value of your cooperation. That is the only offer you will receive, and it is more generous than you deserve. And so Reginald Hammond confessed. He named the other conspirators, detailed the conspiracy's origins and objectives, confirmed his active participation in his brother's treason and his orchestration of Amelia's framing and near execution. He tried repeatedly to minimize his own culpability while emphasizing the guilt of others, but the Lord Chancellor cut through his self-serving narrative with sharp questions that forced acknowledgement of his own agency and guilt. When the confession finally ended, the Lord Chancellor sat in silence for several minutes, reviewing documents and making notes. Then he raised his eyes to address the assembled parties. "I have heard sufficient evidence to render judgment on the matters before this court. The marriage between Lucian Cartwright, Duke of Ashmore, and Lady Amelia Thornefield is legitimate and binding, having been properly executed and authenticated 6 years prior to Lady Amelia's subsequent union with the Earl of Merryweather. That subsequent marriage was therefore invalid from its inception, making all charges of adultery or betrayal of marriage vows groundless." He turned his gaze to Amelia, and his expression softened slightly. "Lady Amelia Thornefield is hereby exonerated of all charges of murder. The evidence clearly demonstrates that she acted in self-defense against a violent attack and that the Earl's death was accidental rather than premeditated. Furthermore, her actions in attempting to expose his treason show patriotic duty rather than criminal intent. All previous convictions are overturned, and her full rights and reputation are restored." Amelia felt Lucian's hand grip hers beneath the table, felt the tremor of relief that ran through him matching her own. But the Lord Chancellor was not finished. "Reginald Hammond, you are hereby charged with treason, conspiracy against the Crown, attempted murder, witness intimidation, and obstruction of justice. You will be remanded to the Tower of London to await trial before a specially convened tribunal that will address the full scope of the conspiracy you have detailed. The other individuals you have named will be arrested and charged accordingly. This conspiracy represents one of the most serious threats to the realm uncovered in recent memory, and it will be prosecuted with the full weight of Crown authority." The chamber erupted in chaos as guards moved to take Hammond into custody. His lawyers protested loudly but futilely, their expensive objections meaningless in the face of overwhelming evidence and the Lord Chancellor's unequivocal judgment. Hammond's eyes found Amelia one last time as he was led away, filled with impotent hatred and the knowledge that his carefully constructed world had collapsed entirely. The Lord Chancellor dismissed the hearing, but requested that Lucian, Amelia, and Lady Rosalind remain for a private audience. When the chamber had cleared and only Tobias remained as witness, the Lord Chancellor's formal demeanor softened into something approaching genuine warmth. "Lady Amelia, you have done your country a great service by refusing to be silenced despite extraordinary pressure and mortal danger. The conspiracy you uncovered reaches deeply into our government and military, and rooting it out completely will require months of investigation and prosecution. You have my personal gratitude and the gratitude of the Crown. Lady Rosalind, your courage in testifying against your own husband at great personal cost will not be forgotten. Arrangements will be made to ensure your financial security and protection going forward." He turned to Lucian with the respect of one old soldier to another. "Your Grace, your service to the realm did not end when you returned from the colonies. You have protected your wife, preserved crucial evidence, and helped bring traitors to justice. The Crown is in your debt." They left the royal courts as twilight painted London in shades of purple and gold. The nightmare was over. Justice had been served, truth had triumphed over corruption, and Amelia could finally breathe freely for the first time in months. 3 weeks later, Cartwright Manor had been restored to its former elegance. The broken windows had been replaced, the blood scrubbed from floors, the scars of battle erased by careful work and generous expenditure. The grounds were decorated with autumn flowers and ribbons, and a small gathering of friends and loyal allies assembled in the manor's chapel for a ceremony that was both ending and beginning. Amelia wore a gown of ivory silk trimmed with delicate lace, her auburn hair arranged in elegant curls adorned with small white roses. She looked nothing like the terrified woman who had stood on the gallows months before, nor even like the determined fighter who had helped defend the manor against mercenaries. She looked like a woman who had walked through fire and emerged transformed, stronger and more beautiful for the tempering. Lucian stood waiting for her at the chapel altar, dressed in formal attire, his scarred face reflecting emotions he no longer tried to hide. Love, pride, joy, and the fierce protectiveness that would never entirely leave him when it came to this remarkable woman. The ceremony was simple and deeply personal. They spoke vows that acknowledged the years of separation and suffering, the trials that had tested them both, and their choice to build a future together based not on old promises but on who they had become. When Lucian slipped a ring onto Amelia's finger, it represented not just marriage but partnership, not just love but respect earned through shared struggle. Mrs. Langford wept openly. Charlotte stood with Tobias, who had been given leave to attend, both of them bearing witness to a union forged in adversity's crucible. Lady Rosalind smiled through her own tears, seeing in their happiness hope for her own future beyond the wreckage of her old life. That evening, as the last guests departed and twilight settled over the grounds, Lucian and Amelia stood together on the manor's terrace. The autumn air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of wood smoke and dying leaves. Behind them, the manor glowed with warm candlelight. Before them, the ground stretched away into peaceful darkness. "What do you think the future holds for us?" Amelia asked, leaning into Lucian's embrace, feeling his arms come around her with familiar strength. "Whatever we choose to make of it. We have been given a second chance that many people never receive. We have survived injustice and violence, conspiracy and betrayal. We have learned what we are capable of when tested. Now we get to discover what we can build together when the testing is done." Amelia turned in his arms to face him, her emerald eyes reflecting starlight and the glow from the manor's windows. "I want to build something meaningful. Something that honors what we have survived and helps others who face similar injustice. Perhaps a foundation to assist those wrongly accused who lack the resources to defend themselves properly." Lucian smiled, and it transformed his scarred face into something close to the young officer she had married so long ago. "That sounds perfect. We will build it together, along with everything else our future holds. Children, if we are blessed. A home filled with love and purpose rather than darkness and isolation. A partnership that stands as proof that even the most broken things can be made whole again when courage and love refuse to surrender." They stood together in the gathering darkness, two people scarred by time and circumstance who had chosen to hope, to fight, to love despite everything that had tried to destroy them. The past could not be changed, but the future stretched before them filled with possibility. And they would face it together, as they had faced everything else, with courage and devotion and the absolute certainty that they had found in each other something worth every trial they had endured. The stars emerged one by one in the darkening sky, and inside Cartwright Manor, candles burned warm and bright, illuminating a home that was no longer a fortress against the world but a haven where love had triumphed and where two souls had finally found their way back to each other. If you found yourself moved by Amelia and Lucian's journey, I would be so grateful if you would show your support by hitting that like button. Your engagement truly helps bring more epic historical romances like this one to life. And if you are new to this channel, welcome. This is a place where every tale explores love, courage, and the strength we discover when tested by impossible circumstances. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. We are building a wonderful community of romance enthusiasts here, and I would be honored to have you join us. Which moment in Amelia and Lucian's story resonated most deeply with you? Was it the dramatic rescue at the gallows when he caught her fall? The moment they finally confessed their enduring love in the garden? Or perhaps the triumphant scene in the Lord Chancellor's chambers when justice finally prevailed? Drop a comment below and let us discuss. I read every single comment, and your thoughts mean the world to me, more than you know. If you are craving more passionate historical romance filled with danger, intrigue, and love that conquers all obstacles, check out the next story I'm putting at the top right corner. I think you will absolutely fall in love with the fierce heroine and brooding hero whose journey will capture your heart. Thank you for spending this time with me today. Until our next story, remember that love is always worth fighting for. Courage can be found in the darkest moments, and sometimes the most powerful act of all is choosing to hope when hope seems impossible. I will see you in the next tale.